Hello and welcome to TMI with Aldous Tyler for Friday, March 4th, 2022. Now, of course, as has been in the news everywhere now for well over a week, we have a situation in Ukraine where Russia is just not respecting boundaries. Now, as you may know, I myself am not an international expert. I do my best to keep informed, but I do know someone who's been, as Johnny Cash once sang, everywhere, or at least so it would seem. I would like to bring on at this time Greg Palast, who is known for his investigative journalism and reports for The Guardian, Democracy Now!, also New York Times bestsellers, including The Best Democracy Money Can Buy. Greg, welcome to TMI.
Glad to be with you again, Aldous.
Definitely glad to have you back. Now, as I was saying, Putin doesn't respect boundaries.
Well, yeah, and you learned that in elementary school. Respect boundaries. Don't reach over and steal your friend's candy or girlfriend.
Right.
Yeah. So it is. It's violent and it's horrible. And there's no excuse. What we have to do is now get some facts to get some information. And I should also note that I've been getting reports. We have 3 members of our team there. Nick Parapolitsa, who is Ukrainian. He is reporting to us and sending us films and information from Kharkiv, which is the absolute center of the fight. That's the second largest
city there in Ukraine,
in the east. So he's been sending me film and reports. We also have Margarita Ivanova, who is going to be covering the protests in Moscow, and Yuri Kirshner. So let me hats off. Well, I never take my hat off, but hats on to the Palast investigative team. I'm not on the front lines. They are. And so, one of the things I want to explain that in effect, there are 2 wars going on here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there's the war over the eastern Ukraine, which Russia claims is Russia. Then there's the war over Kiev and the rest of Ukraine. They're actually incredibly different, and it's important we understand this distinction. From which I'm getting is number. And by the way, just so you know, the latest. Let me give you the latest war report, because I know that's what people want. But so Nick, in our man in Kharkiv, he said, the 3 days ago when he was there, he actually sent us video, which I can share with you, of literally Russian troops walking into the city under his window.
Wow.
The next tape we get is of a Russian convoy of armored vehicles just destroyed. There's blood and shrapnel everywhere. These Russians. So what happened is that the Russians came into the city and effectively got trapped there. So a lot of the Russians were caught, they were slaughtered, they were driven out of the city. Therefore, yesterday, and I'm speaking to you on Monday, the 28th, yesterday on Sunday, there was almost no conflict in the Kharkiv area, because the Russians thought, well, you move into a city with your tanks and your weapons and that's it. But they didn't realize how difficult urban warfare is, and they got pushed back. And today, I would assume it's out of some type of Putin's frustration that he didn't just have his blitzkrieg didn't blitz. They've been shelling the city heavily, and that's killing civilians, of course. And there some photos. People.
You start bringing out the artillery. There's just no way to completely differentiate between,
and they don't
houses
want to.
And other things.
You can. If you're, real military figures out how to attack soldiers. But of course, we have to raise the question, like, why is Putin attacking Ukrainian soldiers? So in the Ukraine now, understand now let me go back to the war. So to the 2 wars, as I say. First, there's the Donbass, which is the west of Ukraine, and if you can include in that the Crimea,
right?
Excuse me, not the west, the east, the far east. Now, the truth is, whether we like it or not, that's a Russian territory. It's been Russia. It is filled with Russians. The overwhelming the population is overwhelmingly not only Russian speaking, but then this is very important, Russian Orthodox following the Patriarch of Moscow. There's been very, very little discussion of a key driver of this violence, which is a religious difference.
Right.
We want to replay the Cold War, that it's, the Russians, or you even have reporters talking about the Soviets, the Russians, the Russian bear versus the freedom loving Americans. Forget all that. It's not the replay of the Cold War. It's a replay of the Crusades. And it's a replay of the schism in the church of, hundreds of centuries long splits in the church.
Right.
And some more new. So most people in the East are Russian speakers, Russian Orthodox, Russian ethnics, and they've always been part of Russia. In fact, I have distant in-laws, very distant, I barely know them, who are in the Donbass, and they consider themselves Russian. Ukrainians have not been in the Donbass and Crimea for 8 years, remember. It's been basically under Russian control.
Right.
14,000 people have died in that Eastern conflict. So that, and understand when I say it's always been part of Russia, the Crimea and Donbass were not given to Ukraine, did not end up in Ukraine until 1954, when in a fight between Khrushchev, who had just taken over when Stalin died. Khrushchev was the premier of the party. And there's also a Russian government head, which is the prime minister, which was Georgy Melenkov. So you had this fight between Khrushchev and Melenkov, and Khrushchev simply seized part of Melenkov's base in Crimea and the Donbass and gave it to his buddy in the Ukraine. So it's an internal Politburo fight that resulted in these Russians being lopped off and given to Ukraine. So now those Russians want to go back to Russia. So that's why the vote in Crimea, many people know Greg Palast, know me. And if you've read my books, Best Democracy Money Can Buy, or see me on Democracy Now! Or BBC, whatever, I usually specialize in vote theft and voting around the world, not just America. There's no question that the people of Crimea voted to be part of Russia. Part of it is that their pensions, these are mostly retired naval people, because that's the big base at Sebastopol. Their pensions went up 500% because they're part of Russia instead of Ukraine, which pays this paltry equivalent of about $80 a month pensions. So people really did want the Russians want to go back to Russia. Now that's one battle.
Right.
Putin won that war last week or 2 weeks ago.
Right.
That is Ukraine.
He could have stopped right there.
Effectively, the Ukraine's never controlled the Donbass, has not been in Crimea for 8 years. Putin's rolling tanks into the eastern Ukraine was simply confirming a reality on the ground. And frankly, what the people of that area want. They're Russians who want to be part of Russia. So he wins the war, but then the real battle starts. And I have to say, I've talked to some experts, and we're all kind of confused as to why he's continuing the war after he's won. Hubris. There may be, the only other thing I can bring into it, and again, I can't reach into the mind of a dictator. I try not to, but and by the way, I use the term advisedly. When you kill, poison, and imprison your opponents, that makes you a dictator. So I can't reach into Putin's mind, but I do know that he does have a base. Even dictators have to run for re-election. They need that 102% vote. Right. And of course, in Russia, when you lose your popularity, you can remember that one way that, often you have a change of government through a bullet. Putin has to be very careful. And his big base is with the Orthodox Church and the Patriarch Kirill. Kirill, the Patriarch out of Moscow, was reasonably concerned that thousands of his co-religionists, his followers, were being slaughtered in the Donbass. With this endless artillery shelling from both sides. 14,000 people died, including 3,000 civilians, almost all of them Russian ethnics. So he had a real concern about protecting his people. But he also has a second concern, which could concern us and seems to concern Putin. Kirill was also the patriarch for Kiev. Then Kiev split off and created its own patriarchate. So it has its own patriarch in Kiev. By the way, the third big religion there is the Greek Orthodox Church, which is kind of aligning with the Ukrainian Church on this issue. So you got this really a medieval conflict going on, and we have to understand that there is no grounds. I'm a big fan of elections and self-determination. If the Russians want to go back to Russia in the East, and I should also say there's a split within the Ukrainian community that is young people who are not very religious and don't follow these things. They're more than happy to give up the Donbass and Crimea. It was never really part of their country or their thinking. Ukraine's become a high-tech center. It's the reason why I have 2 Ukrainians on our staff, is that they're tech experts. They handle our computers and our design work, et cetera. It's, so young people are living in this in places like Lviv in the West are more than happy to give up, the Russians who are hanging out on the eastern edge. Older Ukrainians are not so happy. They see this as a issue of patriotism versus their former Russian occupiers. So there's a bit of a split. We'll see, that might play out. The reason I bring that up might play out in any terms that are going to be agreed upon if we can get to an agreement. So in a way, it was easy for the Russians to take back old Russia, the Donbass and Crimea.
Right.
But what they're finding is that they are now running into Ukrainians who now are fighting, as far as they're concerned, for their country, and they're ready to give up their lives. I haven't heard a Ukrainian yet who hasn't told me, I will die for this. And that's why the Russians cannot make any progress there. I'll add one other thing in this filibuster of mine, which is I did speak to a top what's called future warfare integration expert for the U.S. military. I don't want to give out his name at this moment because I don't know how much I was allowed to say, but he said, look, he was not, he said it's very hard, and the United States itself has learned this lesson in a bloody manner. You can't take cities with tanks. You can't maneuver within a city with tanks. You can't, and you're sold, turrets of tanks can't really reach above a second floor of a building. The infantry which follows tanks can easily be slaughtered. This is what happened. The Russians roll into Kharkiv and they got slaughtered and pushed out. A lot of people can die. Then they can move to bombardment, which is basically just slaughtering civilians. Right. But it's very hard because people are shocked that the Russians have been unable to take a single city. I'm still trying to find out the fate of Odessa, but my understanding is that not one city has been taken because, as I've been told, it's incredibly difficult to do unless the people want you there. Like not everyone was in love with Saddam Hussein, so it allowed us to go into Baghdad. But it's pretty much universal preparation. People will do anything to stop the Russians from staying in their cities. Right. So that's a status on the city. So, it's a horrid situation, but I wanted to distinguish between that Russian edge, which is always part of Russia. It's gone back to Russia now. We might also see one more province added to the Luhansk, Donetsk, and Crimea. That would be Kherson, which is basically a Russian area. And that would give Russia the entire east and its bordering areas that border on Russia. But then when, for whatever reasons, whether it's religion, hubris, Napoleonic urges, I don't know what's motivating Putin, but he has caused this second war, which he is losing. And that's unfortunately, while he's in the process of losing, he's in the process of killing, and that's a big problem. Okay.
Well, all right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I want to say, if you want this kind of in-depth analysis of current events, make sure to keep an eye on gregpalast.com. That is where you'll find Greg's reports regularly filed by himself and other journalists that work with him, his team. So again, gregpalast.com, keep an eye on that, because this is honestly, Greg, one of the reasons why I'm having you on right now is I know that you recently talked about how there are some of the sanctions that we have put elsewhere in the world that if we would simply lift, could solve a good bit of this.
Yeah. So the question is, what do we do about Ukraine? I mean, obviously, the Ukrainians would like weapons and ammunition and internet and et cetera. It's amazing that the Russians, by the way, have knocked out the power of the internet, which just shows an extraordinary weakness on their part. But the real question is, what does Putin really care about in the end, besides staying in power? Oil,
money,
oil. It always comes down to the oil, and say, wait, Ukraine doesn't have a lot of oil. It's not like he's invading Baghdad here. The answer is, and it's not about even the pipeline. What it is, this mayhem has been a profit center for Putin. That is 40%, 43% for last count of the Russian budget was provided by oil revenues and oil royalties, oil and gas. 43% of the entire federal budget, all the Social Security, every program and military, et cetera. So Russia lives and dies literally on its oil revenues. And this mayhem has caused the price of oil to hit $100 a barrel. Now, what that means to Putin versus $50 a barrel, which also raises the price of gas. So his revenues are increasing about a half. He has a war windfall of about $500 million a day. So he's making money literally as long as he keeps the mayhem going. And now the question is, so what can we do to bring down the price of oil because that's going to bring Putin to his knees. It's amazing. He's a powerful man at $100 a barrel. He's pretty weak at $30 a barrel. Last year he was devastated and you didn't hear much from the guy. Mm-hmm. And when oil was down, in fact, for one day, it was actually a negative price in the world market. People didn't know where to put the oil because no one was, the world was shut down.
Right.
So how do we do this? So to your question about other embargoes, we have been embargoing the nation with the largest supply of oil on the planet, Venezuela. No one's talking about this. It's like it fell off the radar. What Putin is doing in Ukraine is cruel and horrific. And what we are doing in Venezuela is cruel and horrific. We have embargoed and laid siege to and basically surrounded, blockaded Venezuela so that very little of its oil can get out. Now, this is a country which has a 2 million barrel a day OPEC allotment, and we're getting almost none of it.
Wow.
2 million barrels a day now, and they have a tremendous gas reserve. So if the Germans are afraid that Putin will cut off their pipe, well, stop cutting off Venezuela's pipe, because it's not only the United States, it's the European Union and Britain, which are saying we won't take Venezuelan oil. We won't take Venezuelan oil, and even more, we won't let Venezuela pump the oil, because what we're doing is the embargo has stopped them from getting the parts and equipment that they need to keep their oil industry running, which is quite complex because it's based on heavy oil. So it's very difficult to, without the parts, the expertise, and the funding, and for example, we've bought the Koch brothers. Actually, they have a refinery in the Gulf Coast of Texas. They are the number one customer. They were the number one customer of Venezuela. We took the oil that Venezuela sent us to the Koch brothers refinery, and the U.S. Treasury seized all the money so that if Venezuela sells oil, they can't get the money. So obviously they're not going to sell it to us or to Europe because they can't get the money. So their oil supplies, their oil production is extremely limited. People are literally starving and they don't have medicine to fight COVID. It's cruel. It's horrible. It's if Putin were doing this in Ukraine now, they're trying to block Ukraine. We'd be screaming and hollering, but yet we're doing it to Venezuela. And who's suffering from it? We are, because we're knocking, more than 1 million barrels a day out of the world market. If we said, okay, Vlad, we're going to make you a deal. If you, Putin, will recognize the elected government of Ukraine, we will recognize the elected government of Venezuela. And that's our problem. This is a leftover Trump disaster. Trump cut off Venezuela, ordered the embargo, ordered the blockade, And all why? Well, number one, they say, well, Venezuela is not really a democratic nation. So instead, we're getting our oil and gas from the democratic nation of Saudi Arabia, from the democratic nation. By the way, our biggest source of imports into the West is Russia. So the great democracies we'd rather get our oil and gas from are China, from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Russia, Kazakhstan, where I've been, and another police state. These are the great democracies instead of Venezuela. And let me tell you, I've been in Venezuela. I covered Venezuela for BBC Television and The Guardian. I got to know not only the presidents, I knew Hugo Chavez very well. I also know the current president, Nicolas Maduro. And I got to know, and in fact became quite friendly with several of the opposition figures. But I have to tell you, whether we like it or not, Maduro was fairly elected. Just as I said, in the Crimea, the Russians voted to rejoin Russia. We have to accept that. We also have to accept that the Venezuelan people chose Maduro. Now, I'm going to tell you, I know Maduro. He's not necessarily my cup of tea. I think he's over his head as a leader. I think he's screwing this all up. But I'm not a Venezuelan voter. The Venezuelans have chosen him. And the reason why is, instead of like reasonable and rational opposition leaders, and there are some like Julio Borges, I'm not campaigning for him. I'm just saying he's a reasonable and rational guy.
Fair enough.
Is we have the Trump and now Biden, of all people, have been recognizing a guy named Juan Guaido as the president of Venezuela. Now, let me tell you how really weird that is. Juan Guaido has basically lived his life in Washington, D.C. until Trump came in. He didn't even get close to Venezuela. He's also a very rich white guy working for think tanks. And white is an important discussion here, because for 400 years, white people, what they called themselves the Spaniards, ran Venezuela, took all its money, and most people got nothing. Here they're sitting on a gigantic, the world's largest reserve of oil, according to OPEC, and yet the people got nothing. Hugo Chavez came in, the first non-white head of state, as he says, I'm negro e indio, I'm black and Indian, and they didn't like it, and they hate it. And they want to force Venezuela to accept this guy, Guaido. Now, understand, Guaido didn't even, it's not like he can claim, oh, they stole the election from me. Guaido never ran for president. He didn't run for president. And yet the US and the European Union and the UK have all recognized Guaido as the president. When Venezuela sells oil, we literally give it to this guy, Guaido. Imagine if in California, because we're an oil state in California, and we sold our oil to Japan or wherever, or back to Ohio, and we were told, no, you can't send any money to California, forget it. And by the way, we're not going to let you have food or medicine. We're going to cut you off. So if we end the embargo of Venezuela, we'll crash the price of oil. How much? I can only guess, but we do know that I would figure about $20 a barrel. I've been in this, I'm an economist by training. I've done energy a long time. It would probably be at least $20 a barrel. You might say, well, what's the big deal? That's a really big deal to Vlad Putin. I'll tell you that right now.
Well, yeah.
And also the fact that it won't just be a one-time bump down. If we can reach a peace agreement with Venezuela, and after all, an embargo is an act of war. If we can have peace with our neighbor to the south and accept their elected government, I think that that would cut off Putin at the knees. He's a very powerful man when oil's at $100 a barrel. At 60, he doesn't have such a big mouth, let me tell you.
Understood. And the other thing, Greg, is that I'm right up there with you when I want people to understand that the word embargo is this nice sounding word, or at least maybe not nice sounding, but it's a much more pleasant sounding word than economic warfare. So
or siege. It's a siege.
Right.
Like it's a medieval method. Right. A siege of a nation where you literally stop medicine and food, and you don't give them their own money. You know that Britain took $10 billion of gold bullion, which was sitting in the Bank of England that belonged to Venezuela. And they literally seized it and gave it to this guy, Guaido. This is insane. You know, when Hugo Chavez had the gold bricks removed from the Federal Reserve in New York and Fort Knox, where Venezuela's gold reserves were kept, and he demanded that they be sent back to Caracas. People say, oh, that's crazy stuff. Boy, he made a mistake by leaving his gold bullion in Britain. So it wasn't crazy. We did seize that nation's assets. Then we say, oh, look how terrible their economy is. Well, wait a minute. You just stole all their money. You crushed their oil industry. And now we're paying the price, literally paying the price in Ukraine and literally paying the price at the pump. We got to stop this war in Venezuela. And no one's talking about it.
So basically, it could easily, well, I try to, it could easily be said then that the economic siege and warfare that we've been waging on Venezuela, us and the EU and Great Britain altogether, essentially has helped cause a good bit of motivation for what Putin's now doing in Ukraine.
Yeah, we're funding, in effect, we're funding his war by keeping all this oil and gas off the market. Venezuela has enough gas. If you liquefy it, and they liquefy it in Trinidad, you liquefy that gas, you don't need Nord Stream 2, and you don't need Nord Stream 1. You know, let's not forget, Nord Stream 2 may have been shut off, but Nord Stream 1 is bringing 1.9 trillion cubic feet of gas into Germany every day from Russia. So the Russians are laughing at some of these sanctions. The oligarchs won't be able to get tickets to Hamilton? They're getting richer than Croesus with this massive windfall from oil. We have to shut off the wind machine so that Trump, the Trump of Russia, the Trump of Russia, his idea of a spending spree is rolling tanks. And it's amazing what will happen when the oil money gets shut off.
Well, $500 million a day of profit will buy you a good bit of war.
Yeah.
So, Greg Palast, again, thank you so much. I did want to add one other thing. As you mentioned, the two wars involved, the first one being the making sure that the ethnically Russian parts of Ukraine were essentially rejoined to Russia. That being the one part. One part of that might be part of at least one of the things that might wind up being, hopefully, in some sort of treaty to end this thing. That Putin might insist on is the unblocking of the canal that supplies fresh water to Crimea, because that got blocked after the 2014 annexation, and apparently Crimea is almost like a desert now, thanks to climate change, of course, but also the fact that they don't have the fresh water flowing in.
Well, Putin did build a bridge. So they can, there's ways for them to actually get that water. But yeah, obviously, there's plenty of grounds for an agreement to be reached. While it would be very difficult for Zelensky, he might have to sign a deal and then resign to say, okay, we'll recognize Crimea and the Donbass as Russia, because it is. As long as Russia and Putin recognize Ukraine as Ukraine.
Right. And
so, I mean, obviously,
you
and I can say, well, this is a very good grounds. There's something that these guys can trade to lead to peace. Zelensky, while as being Jewish, doesn't have a dog in the fight between these, the religious schism within the Orthodox Church. Right. But he also has his voters. And like I say, the older people, not the younger people, the older people will scream bloody murder if he officially recognizes the Russian areas going back to Russia. Younger people are not so attached to it because it hasn't really been effectively, it hasn't been part of Ukraine for quite some time. Mm-hmm. So there are definitely grounds to end this conflict. And let's remember that there were a lot of Russian ethnics killed in the past 8 years. It's a war that we haven't discussed, and it's mostly been the Russian ethnics who've bled in that war. But, in a way, it was resolved by Putin's rolling tanks into the Donbass. And obviously that protects Crimea. If you can look at a map, Crimea is a peninsula that's east of the eastern provinces of Ukraine. And, so again, there's good grounds for peace. there's no good grounds for war, and hopefully the world will say there are grounds. In a way, you almost have to impose this type of peace on the parties, because it's very difficult for any Ukrainian leader to say you can have the East. Right. It has to be imposed on them. But again, when we do that, let's include in the peace agreement peace with Venezuela.
Oh yes, that makes perfect sense to me. Greg Palast, thank you again for joining me as I attempt on a weekly basis to be the cure for the common media, and you, sir, are certainly the uncommon media. I appreciate very much the job you and your team do. And again, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to keep up with Greg Palast and what his team's doing, and I highly recommend you do, check out gregpalast.com. Look for him on your bookshelves, and you can check him out occasionally on Democracy Now, I believe, and a few other spots. So, Greg, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome, buddy.